Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You can also become a bitter pill, spoonful of sugar, or the medicine going down, where we've got some fabulous swag. And now we have all sizes of the T-shirts that came out about a month ago. We only had large before, but now we've got medium, large, and extra large. And that's it. I'm not going to go small, and I'm not going to go double extra large. If you're double extra large, we'll have a conversation, get you out the fried chicken. Extra large is as far as I go, because these things cost money. So there's that. Neener. My guest today, friend of the show, good friend of mine, U.S. Army veteran, works with Vets for Peace. And, we're going to chop it up a little bit about some different wars and things like that, and kind of go through the greatest hits of the United States. Basically, that's it. Chris Ward, how are you, man?
I'm doing great. Always an honor to be invited onto the show. Appreciate you.
I'm going to cry. That's nice of you. How you been? What's going on?
Hey, not a lot. Just yesterday spent time with a veteran organization that's building a sustainable community near Sedalia, Colorado. It's great. They seek to house about 100 homeless veterans. And it's also, on top of it, become a wolf sanctuary. So they have 16 head of wolves, everything varying from, half wolf to full timber wolf. So I got to go in and play with the wolves and work on the beginning construction. It was a project that started back in December. Of course, you have the winter and then COVID on top of each other. So
sure,
development had stagnated, but they're looking to get full steam. And I think it's an incredible project.
That's neat, man. How long have you been working with this?
Yesterday.
Oh, okay. So it's okay. So you just, okay, right on, man. Well, hey, listen, man, we were talking a little bit before, and you've been on before, and you've, always, you've got a great perspective because you are an actual veteran, and you've seen the inner workings. And unlike a lot of people, frankly, you know your history, and you're pretty well read on things. And I just wanted to kind of, because I remember last year we went into Venezuela, and then we went into Bolivia, and I live in Austin, super blue, chewy blue center of big red Texas. And I had a lot of buddies out here that I've, become friends with the last 5-6 years. And they just go right along with the corporate line. When Bolivia happened, it was like, well, he'd been president for 14 years. That's a long time. And I'm thinking, well, gee, Angela Merkel has been prime minister for 15 years. Why don't we just take over Germany then? Because that was a long time, right? Or Putin's been there for 20 years. Let's just, bomb Russia. Let's we're already sanctioning them. Let's just take it over, And it's not, I'm going to go back a little bit, but it's not like in our lifetime, we've been lied into a lot of wars, and it's pretty unanimous on that. And then every time something comes up, it just seems like people are chomping at the bit to just jump right in. Venezuela, same thing. Nobody gave a shit about the poor people of Venezuela when they had a 50% poverty rate and people were starving to death in the 80s and 90s. Chavez comes in, nationalizes everything, and now suddenly everybody cares about democracy. Right. And so, but this isn't new, right? And we don't want to go all the way back to, say, the Revolutionary War, but let's just start fairly recently, which kind of molded the rest of the American century. Let's just start with the Spanish-American War for a hot minute and, just go from there.
I love that I love that you wanted to start there, because I think it was prior to that, it was all about the colonists looking out for their own personal interests inside the land of, now considered the United States. And it was the first time when we talk about the Spanish-American War that we talk about American influence in the global theater.
Right.
As we step into Cuba, which of course you and I could go into just how everything from, dating back then all the way to present day, our relationship with Cuba. And it's aggravating to me that a lot of Americans, we have this permeating idea of American exceptionalism that we do no wrong.
Right.
And every conflict, as you said, there's been a hindrance before the conflict where the American people are like, no, we can't get involved, to, the bombing of the USS Maine, whether that been just an explosion, it was never determined what caused it. And of course, we can go into detail about that. But then all of a sudden something happens. Then all of a sudden, now America's backing the conflict. It happened.
Well, actually, in 1976, the Department of the Navy put out a report 80 years later that the Maine had indeed been an accidental explosion. And so it's not, I mean, I've read this report. It's like the explanation was weird because back then they had this coal thing that wasn't tight yet, and so anyway, it had built up gas or something, and that's what blew up the main, and so yeah, and then Hearst made a war out of it, and Teddy Roosevelt was chomping at the bit to go in. At the time, I think he was Undersecretary of the Navy, and he was chomping at the bit to go in. So we went in on a lie.
Yeah.
But then we stayed. But that was a 4-month excursion where we took over Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, Philippines. Am I missing something? Because we were in the, but my point in that we were in the Philippines for like 13 years after. That was like the second longest conflict after Afghanistan, right?
Yeah. I think it was 3 years after the end of the Spanish-American War where the Philippine revolutionaries were fighting against the U.S. There after we kicked out the Spanish.
Okay. And you make this great point, though, because
but that's it. I mean, when you look at those histories, when they talk, I mean, especially about Hawaii becoming the 50th state, it sounds so nice when they're
right.
When you go into the history of how Hawaii became a state,
right?
And how we, basically took over Guam and the Philippines. It's tragic to look at, and Puerto Rico as well.
And well, in Hawaii, that was another thing of the Spanish American. We got Hawaii, didn't we? In Spanish American, yeah, right.
Later we did, yeah.
Okay, and so see, and then we'll get to World War II in a second because I don't want to piggyback too much, but so we're in the Philippines for a long time. I think until Taft was out of office, right?
Absolutely.
And then we get into World War I, and what happened there? I mean, Lusitania was this minor deal that took 2 years for us to make a thing out of it. And it wasn't like the Brits it wasn't like the Brits weren't warned that if you go into German U-boat lanes, you're going to get torpedoed. I mean, is that too simple?
No, and that was it. Another example of how at the time there was a massive American disdain for us getting involved in World War I. I mean, we largely saw it as the U.S.'s, or that it was Europe's problem, as we did again in World War II.
Right.
I heard it again echoed by then I think it was Secretary of State Warren Christopher when he talked about the Balkan War. I mean, it was 5 years again before we got involved in Bosnia. And so it was after the Germans after the bombing of Lusitania, and then they said, okay, we're going to back off attacking merchant and, travel ships. But then when they upped their game again, because Russians dropped out of the war because they were already dealing with their own revolution in, 1917, the Germans like, oh, we got to up our game now.
Right.
And so they went back on it. And then Americans were like, well, we can't allow this. And so that's how we kind of sparked American interest in getting back into, of course, it was under Wilson.
Right. And Wilson ran for re-election on that he kept us out of war.
Yeah. Up until, what was it?
1917.
1917.
Yeah. And then and Lusitania happened in 1915.
Yeah.
And the drums were kind of beating slow. And then finally, and then, we, same shit we do all the time. We took sauerkraut and turned it into Liberty Cabbage and, started banning German composers to be played in the United States. Couldn't play Beethoven anymore. There's all this weird shit going on. But so leading up and getting us into that war, what do you think drove that propaganda? Like, what do you think? Why did the American people suddenly have a stomach for World War I when 3-4 years before Archduke Ferdinand gets shot in 1914? The whole thing starts, and we're not going to, nobody wants to go. Nobody wants to go, and all of a sudden by 1917 we're in. Well,
and it was the piece of propaganda that really sealed the deal. Not only was the unleashing of the German U-boats, but was the Zimmermann telegram. So what Germans had done was let Mexico know that there was such a percentage of American land that they would give to Mexico if they decided to side with the Germans.
Okay.
And so that very telegram was used as the propaganda machine that Wilson took into the cabinet to say, we can't allow this because now, Germans working with our, with countries around us, and we saw this with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and and we'll get into that later. But they use this as that propaganda machine, and it was almost no time. All the newspapers in the United States were running copies of the Zimmerman telegram, and it was I think it was not shortly thereafter that the Americans decided that they were going to declare war.
Wow. And then Walter Lippmann, who, famously took journalism and he kind of formalized it into a propaganda machine. I mean, Hearst and a bunch of other, this is, now we're so condensed in how much media is owned by so few people. It was like that before. There's only a handful of guys that owned media. I mean, Hearst owned like 60% of the American newspapers. So he was pretty much the voice of America. They just couldn't really control him. So if he didn't like you, then he would say stuff or have his writers say stuff. But Lippmann was able to kind of take it and formalize it in like its own government PR department, right? Mm-hmm. So they basically, use that machine to, demonize the Germans. And wasn't that about the time the government got into the movie business? Because the War Department, up through the OSS, CIA, through the Defense Department, they've been involved in something like 2,000 movies, and TV shows. And this is kind of the beginning of that, right?
Well, and it was, and I use that part of the argument as a part of the American nationalism, because when the arguments came over how politicized sporting events came with airing the Star Spangled Banner at the beginning, that actually started in 1918 during one of the, I think it was probably the first World Series, that the game just kind of sucked so bad, the band started playing the Star Spangled Banner, which that would not become the American
anthem
until 1931, I think, or something like that.
Okay.
And so that was always a propaganda tool. So like you said, during the films, they used to do the news from the front lines.
Right.
And they used to show these black and white cutouts that had you didn't even know what you were really looking at.
Right.
They would go, Germans getting shot and this and that. And they were like, this is where we really painted Germany as the enemy, which they were very careful about just because of the number of German immigrants that were living in the United States at the time.
Right.
They didn't want to have this massive backlash. So they really, kept that, unlike what we did against the Japanese Americans in World War II.
Right.
They really tried to shield that. They're like, the Germans in Germany are the enemy, not the ones here.
Right. Right.
Because they didn't want the backlash of, all of a sudden it's like, well, hey, 30% of us are German.
Right. Right.
And they were, so yeah, it was always used as a propaganda tool. And when they showed those videos, the Star Spangled Banner was one of those musical accompaniments to the propaganda videos that they used during World War I.
Well, isn't it kind of funny though, like how we keep accusing China and Russia of propaganda, and we're like the king. We are the kings of propaganda. I mean, our shit's
absolutely
propaganda. I mean, before I get into World War
in South Korea, I've stood under the speakers that we set up. So North Korea has their speakers broadcasting, propaganda from the north to the south. We mutually have speakers broadcasting, and we've done all the same sinister stuff. Send the balloons with the, let us know if you want out, kind of, little messages that North Korean communists, they're, you can be free of communism. And we do the exact same thing that every other country does.
Well, see, and that's the thing is like, but you mentioned earlier American exceptionalism is that we can do no wrong. I mean, shit, after we took over Puerto Rico, we were doing Mengele-like experiments. We were forcing sterilizations on women after the third kid and testing drugs on them. Like, there's this one doctor, I'm forgetting the name of the doctor, but he was there for like 10 years until they called him home and, put him in jail because he was like, and his journals were just damning because he was just like, and all these people don't feel any pain, that they won't even know, whatever. And you're kind of going, wow, it was just, we do shit like that. I mean, this would not look good in the box in Nuremberg, right? And so, but I guess after World War I, we weren't involved in anything else after that, right? There wasn't any minor kerfuffles or whatever.
Kerfuffles?
Yeah, that's the military term.
I mean, when you look at the United States, we've been involved in a degree of conflicts. I think they said out of 200, I think right now we're at 244 years since the whenever the ratification of August of 1776 when the Declaration was ratified.
Right.
We've been at war, I think, 90% of the time.
Yeah, I've seen that stat too.
Involved in some conflict or another. So if it wasn't a major war, we were definitely probing into nation building, putting in puppet dictators, and dictating American economic interests in other countries. That's what happened with Cuba, which would translate into Castro's taking over Batista during the Cuban Revolution, and all of a sudden they just severed economic ties with the United States, which.
Well, and then I don't want to get too far ahead of the game, but that you bring up Cuba, something that I like to talk to with these exile radical weirdos is that when they bitch about Castro, right? Mm-hmm. Surprise, surprise. That's why they're here. But one thing I find with these guys is that if you bring up Batista, who was not elected, we installed him. He was our boy, and he was there for 10 years. And he was a dictator, even though he called himself a president.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, well, don't you hold the United States and Batista responsible for the advent of Castro? Because we fucked about for 60 years after we took your country, installed the dictator, which didn't work out well, or you wouldn't have all had a revolution, right?
Exactly.
And it's like I'm doing card tricks in front of a dog, to quote Bill Hicks. I'm like, God damn it. Well, Castro bad. I'm like, okay. Batista is the Shah.
Yeah.
Fight me on that, right? So anyway, but again,
and that's a part of Cuban independence. And it was like 1903 when Cuba became, so we freed them from Spain to roll back into the Spanish-American War.
Right.
We freed them from Spanish rule, and we kind of gave them their independence. But look at the conditions so it became an American protectorate, is what we called it, even though it was an independent nation,
right.
American protectorate. And here were the guidelines. For one, you were not allowed to align with a foreign body. So there was you couldn't create some sort of lineage with anybody else.
Right.
America could intervene at any time
with
state issues. So if there's anything that Cuba was doing, America could dive in. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then number three is that we had like this eternal lease on Guantanamo Bay.
Right. For $4,000 a year.
Yeah.
And Castro
in perpetuity forever.
And Castro has never cashed one of those checks.
Yeah.
It's $4,000. It's $4,000 a year that they get to lease Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah. And Americans never asked, why are we why do we have Guantanamo Bay if Cuba is a communist state and an enemy of the Americas? Then why are we there? And
right.
Because people don't go roll back and just say why. Nobody asks the questions.
Well, they don't. And so, but then getting into World War II, so Pearl Harbor happens. And the war's going on. Again, we don't want to be involved.
Yep.
You got the America Firsters, right?
Well,
you got
Pearl
Charles
Harbor
Lindbergh.
Was the spark that caused Americans to want to get involved.
Right, but then it was sold to us because FDR, Hawaii was still a territory.
Yeah.
And it was still foreign and brown and not American. So he had to sell it to go to war, right? I mean, because Americans weren't foaming at the mouth for the first couple of days, were they? Or am I missing that?
Not till the end of the war. That's why there's so much argument over who won World War II. Because if you talk to the Russians, they say, "Well, we won."
Right.
And you're like, well, America won, because we defeated the Germans. But it's like, well, yeah, but you came in at the 9th inning.
Right. You're the relief pitcher.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, wait a minute, you lost, I'm going to mess up the death toll, but it was something like Russians lost like 25 million people.
Right. Not counting the guys that Stalin killed in his pogroms. Right. That was another 20-odd million people, but which are amazing numbers compared to 10 million people Hitler killed. But no, yeah, they lost about 20 million people in the war, mostly on the Russian front.
Yeah.
But that was kicking Germany's ass. And then the other thing too, this is kind of the point I was making about Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor was a hit and run. The Japanese bombed it and split, but they invaded the Philippines, another one of our territories.
Yep.
But we couldn't sell Americans, and they took bases. They took American bases. They took prisoners, American prisoners. But we couldn't sell the war on the Philippines. It was barely even mentioned.
Yeah.
Right? And the reason why we came up with synthetic rubber was because the Japanese had taken the Philippines and Singapore and Thailand, which we were getting rubber from. So we had to make a synthetic rubber, which we did in about a year. Meanwhile, the Germans were getting all the rubber they wanted because the Japanese were their allies, but it was natural rubber, which froze in Russia.
Right.
And so we ended up almost, like a happy accident discovering synthetic. We a lot of synthetics we discovered out of that inconvenience that the Japanese had put on us, right?
Yeah.
But we couldn't sell. Why couldn't we sell the American public on going to war with Japan on the Philippines? And why did Roosevelt emphasize the American territory of Hawaii without emphasizing the American territory of the Philippines?
It was your economic interests, and we pretty much prodded Japan into a war.
Okay.
It was such strict economic sanctions that Japan had no other options than to attack Hawaii.
Right.
So the challenge was, and this is up for a great debate, but inside intelligence circles, they'll tell you that we watched the planes take off from Okinawa. We saw them in the air as they approached Pearl Harbor. We caught them on radar, and we waited because we knew that would be the thing that would allow us to convince Americans to support our involvement in World War II.
All right. And what would be
an attack that we could have easily caught them in the air? Like it could have been the greatest, Pacific air battle of all time.
Yeah.
Because we had all the, we had the air forces that we could have assembled and got to them in time, and
didn't do it.
Yeah.
And so, we hear this all the time. The big argument is, we needed to get into the war to get us completely out of the Depression. Is that accurate, or what were some of our motivations to get into the war?
Well, this is where I recognize a massive shift in where the large global corporations recognize there's money to be made in war.
Mm-hmm.
So it is no secret now. U.S. Standard Oil provided oil to the Nazis.
That's right.
As well as the United States.
That's right.
General Motors provided parts that went into the German tanks.
Mm-hmm.
I could go on and on.
Opel.
Yeah, make the bombs and the bullets.
Ford was making shit there, and absolutely.
Ford.
And they got reparations, after the war for us bombing their plants.
I know.
And Prescott Bush, who's George Bush's grandfather, W's grandfather, HW's dad, was a finance manager, stock guy, and he was managing American interests and American investments in Nazi Germany, and he was hiding money from prominent Germans in the United States.
Absolutely.
And none of those guys got as much as a boo when the war was over.
And we're only, we've been uncovering, but they've been more involved in understanding the influence of all of the Nazi scientists and doctors and engineers that we brought over to the United States. Nazi, not German.
Right.
Nazis. That we brought to the United States to help develop our programs in medicine, in engineering, in our nuclear weapons programs and nuclear development.
Wow.
And I'm just thinking, if I ran the United States at the time, first of all those companies that help support our enemies would be shut down.
Right.
U.S. Standard Oil, gone.
Right.
Ford Motors, gone. The whole 9 yards. But now this perked up because Ford, and who was it all? Chase, J.P. Morgan Chase.
J.P. Morgan, yep.
Banking institutions. The
Union Bank, yep.
Yeah, the Union Bank. People that were financing both sides of the war. They all of a sudden, all the other big wigs that wanted to be up there at those, at those levels said, hey, there's money to be made at war.
Right.
So as opposed to us just getting involved in existing wars, now what you start to see as we head into the Vietnam era was now we're creating wars, creating conflicts that we can get ourselves involved in.
Mm-hmm.
And I love you bring it up quite frequently. A lot of people don't do it. Is just talking about like Barack Obama's involvement in Syria,
right?
As a grotesque version of us getting involved in a conflict that we ourselves perpetuated because of we helped to finance ISIS after the fall of Saddam Hussein. So we had all these ragtag, all the old military people that worked under Saddam's regime were like, okay, we don't have a job. What do we do now?
Right.
And you get like sickos that said, oh, I got a job for you.
Right. Well, and that's no different than what we did with under Reagan with Afghanistan. Yeah. Right. I mean, we created the government of Afghanistan was a democratically elected government, right? And was running along under when Jimmy Carter was president and just going along, whatever. And then, before Carter left office, he got talked into the idea because Zbigniew, I can never say his first name right, but Brzezinski, his NS advisor guy, his national security advisor guy, he was hell bent on dragging Russia in Afghanistan and creating Vietnam. And he knew that if there was an influx of American aid going to Afghanistan, that the Russians would be provoked.
Yeah.
It wasn't a big mystery that 70,000 Russians just Baryshnikov their way, waltzing into fucking Afghanistan over the border with tanks and everything. It's like, oh, we're surprised. Really? William Casey was senile, so I can imagine we were surprised. But that was a provocation, was it not?
Yeah.
Right. And I want to get, we saw a couple of things here before we wrap up this part of the show. But so what was Korea then? Was that still part of that synthetic that you're talking about, where they were going to create like Truman was going to create a war to satisfy these guys and to satisfy the burgeoning military industrial complex? I mean, it wasn't like they weren't there. They made money in World War I too.
Yeah.
DuPont names, DuPont, Halliburton, they made money in World War I, made money in World War II. But it seemed like they just started getting us on this idea of perpetual war.
Yeah.
So Korea, like what was the impetus to get into Korea? Besides the stopping of communism.
Expansion of Chinese influence on the Korean Peninsula.
Right.
So we were still doing, following, World War I, we had created this monster that, we called communism. And we would use this over and over again. Definitely was part of our involvement in Vietnam, even though Ho Chi Minh was pro-American. So yes, he was a communist leader, but he was pro-American. He had no beef with America, but we had lost our asses in Korea, basically.
Right.
And so that was the greatest challenge, where we've now created a war that we'll never win, because we thought that if we could control a democratically elected state of Korea, that would put us in a military strategic position against China to hinder Chinese expansion.
Right.
Unless you have 1 million more troops than the U.S. does.
Right. Well, we did get into limited. It wasn't. Well, I say limited. It's kind of underselling it, but we did get into a war. We fought Chinese in Korea, did we not?
Absolutely. We got pushed back from the Chinese border all the way back to what's the present day 46th parallel, which is our demilitarized zone.
Okay.
So we drew the line there and like, okay, we're going to hold this position. And so they declared the ceasefire, which the armistice agreement that was signed then, now is well over 60 years old. So they've never actually had the end of the war. So the war still goes there. So U.S. service members that serve in Korea are still considered war veterans, which I think is an abomination of that title, because I served there in 95. And so I could qualify if I send in a little, hey, I served in Korea, they'll send me a Korean war ribbon. But I think that completely devalues the soldiers.
The guys who died.
That fought there. Yeah.
Right.
The only threat to me in Korea was myself.
Right. Right. You get drunk.
Going to the bar. I was the only one causing damage to myself.
Right. So. You sprain your ankle getting off a high curb.
Yeah.
So Eisenhower comes in and he's like, I don't want to go to a war. I don't want to be in a war with China. And he gets us out. Yeah. But then he begins, and it's not like we didn't have a habit of this, but after the UK lost prominence, we got into the habit of taking over where the UK was because they were doing covert shit too in the 20s. They were fucking about in Iran.
Absolutely.
With the Russians. I mean, they were doing all kinds of stuff that we weren't doing because we didn't have the muscle. We didn't have the intelligence down like they did. And then in the 50s, supposedly the CIA, but we started an entirely new thing before Vietnam, all the covert shit we were doing, right? Nicaragua, Guatemala, all these places, right?
Absolutely.
Why was that? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm conflicted on Eisenhower because, here you have a wartime hero who recognized the fact that, I mean, when he handed over, and to go back to Cuba again, when he handed over the Bay of Pigs invasion to JFK, his farewell address specifically spoke to this growing military-industrial complex, which was a direct threat to U.S. democracy.
Right.
And U.S. interests. And he's like, if we don't curtail this beast, which had already grown out of control at this time, it's going to become unmanageable, which over the course of the next 60 years or 70 years has now been, we now recognize that fact, given the current wars that are endless. I mean, we're now almost 19 years in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Christmas came early. These guys got their wish.
They did.
They got their wish. It's trillions of dollars down the fucking toilet, and it doesn't matter whose kids die because it's not your kid dying.
Right.
But that was the point I was going to make really quick about the Eisenhower speech. Everyone goes on about that. Originally, he said in his speech, but the word got cut out. It was called the Congressional Military Industrial Complex.
Mm-hmm.
But at the last minute, he decided to cross that word out. I wish he left it in.
Absolutely.
Because people, everyone wants to seem stable. Now everything comes off as a conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. And one thing I like to tell people is there's conspiracy theory, there's conspiracy fact.
Yeah.
We didn't go to the moon, theory. Russiagate, fucking theory.
Yeah.
Fact is there were no WMDs and we went into a war illegally to get Iraq back on the dollar. That's a fact.
Absolutely.
The PNAC paper that came out in 2000 said as much, right? So getting into Vietnam again, and that was a failed French police action. We had some advisors kind of watching the French in the 50s, right? But we didn't have boots on the ground yet. We're just watching the French get slaughtered, right? I mean, and JFK and RFK famously went there in 53 and they're like, stay the fuck out of here. But this is not going to win. We're not going to win this. Let the French be French, not our interests. Let them fight commies, whatever. But then we got dragged into it.
Yeah.
How did that transition happen? Because when Kennedy took office, there was only 800 advisors in Vietnam. Right. By the time he got shot, it was 16,000 advisors. And then obviously Johnson escalated it. So we got a couple of minutes and we'll pick up on the second part of the show.
Okay.
On the second part. But how did really quick before we finish this episode, like how did we get dragged into Vietnam so badly and so fast?
It was the same thing. Anytime that there is a foreign attack on U.S. troops, it immediately arises that us versus them, and so the American people, so what the CIA did, because JFK was in opposition to our involvement in Vietnam, they orchestrated the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was a false flag.
Right, and this was after he was killed.
Yeah, after he was killed. Because he was never going to let us in. And the CIA couldn't. It's so funny and kind of an aside, but I was talking with a gentleman who does, I'm not going to name him, but he does large audits of financial institutions. So he goes in, arrests bankers for fraud inside financial institutions. And then I was also in the same conversation was a veteran, not military veteran, but a veteran congressman who was a lifelong Republican. And so the three of us got talking about the JFK assassination. And all three of us, as learned as we were on the subject, had different ideas of who killed JFK.
Well, yeah, that's it. Okay. And that's another thing too. Conspiracy theory, conspiracy fact, right?
Right.
If you think Oswald acted alone, then you've never shot a gun ever in your life, ever. And you don't know what physics are. And that's a whole hour by itself. But And Robert McNamara, before he died, did a documentary with Earl Morris, the guy that did Thin Blue Line. It was called The Fog of War. And it was the first time I'd seen this memo, but a month before Kennedy got shot, he was going to pull 1,000 people out of Vietnam.
Yep.
And then by the end of 65, pull everybody out of Vietnam. That was the goal, right? And then he got killed. And Johnson comes in, gets rid of that memo. And then the Gulf of Tonkin happens, which we're going to pick up on the Gulf of Tonkin on the next episode. Guys, real quick, guest has been Chris Ward. Catch him on the part 2 of this America's Greatest Hits. You can always visit us again on patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. And, you can listen to the show for free, obviously, but we always appreciate the support. And if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.